The night was thick with fog, and Preston Castle loomed ahead like a dark wound on the hill, its windows like empty eyes. The locals had warned me, stay away from the castle of lost boys, where vengeful spirits walked. But I ignored them. They said that after midnight, the souls of those who had suffered within those walls returned to haunt. My watch ticked past 12 as I stepped through the creaking door and into the darkness. A faint child's laughter echoed down the empty corridor, and I felt the cold grip of something sinister. I walked deeper into the castle's eerie silence, my footsteps a faint echo on the stone floor. The air was stale, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Stories of the brutal punishments inflicted on the boys here haunted my mind, tales of cells hidden in the basement where screams went unheard. Suddenly, I heard a dragging sound from one of the rooms at the end of the corridor, like someone was pulling something heavy across the floor. Heart racing, I approached, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. The door creaked as I nudged it open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with rows of metal bed frames, rusted and forgotten. On one bed, a figure sat hunched over, his face buried in his hands. He was small, a child, yet his outline seemed to flicker as though caught between this world and the next. Slowly he looked up, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, his skin pale and cracked, and in a voice that was little more than a raspy whisper, he said, "Play with us." I stumbled back, my throat tight, unable to scream. As I turned to flee, I felt icy fingers grip my arm. I yanked away and sprinted down the hall, but it felt as if the walls were closing in around me, their shadows shifting and writhing. From every corner, the faces of children emerged, boys of different ages, each more ghastly than the last. Some wore the scars of cruel beatings, others held open wounds that bled down their torn clothes. They didn't speak, but their eyes were pleading, as though begging me to set them free. Panic surged, and I dashed down a narrow staircase, the cold seeping into my bones. I found myself in the basement, where stories told of solitary cells used for punishment. The darkness was almost impenetrable, but I could make out rusty iron bars and shackles hanging from the walls. A chill washed over me, and a shuffling sound echoed from a corner of the room. Slowly, a figure emerged, a guard in a dusty, blood-stained uniform, his eyes hollow, his face twisted with rage. He held a heavy baton, smeared with something dark and dried, a cruel grin spreading across his face. I turned to run, but he blocked the exit, raising the baton menacingly. "Back to your cell, boy," he hissed, his voice a deep, gravelly echo that reverberated through the dungeon walls. His grip tightened as he raised his arm, and I braced myself for the strike. Just then, the room grew colder, and the faint image of a small boy appeared beside him, holding his arm. The boy's face was pale, his expression full of sorrow, and he whispered, "Please, stop." For a moment, the guard hesitated, his expression faltering, but then he shoved the boy aside. I took the chance and ran, my heart pounding as I heard his heavy footsteps thundering behind me. I sprinted through a maze of corridors, each turn leading deeper into the dark bowels of the castle. The laughter of children echoed around me, growing louder, mingling with screams, until I could no longer tell if it was real or just in my head. Finally, I burst into a room with high, arched windows that let in a sliver of moonlight. But instead of relief, I was met with a circle of spectral children, their pale faces watching me in silent unison. In the center of the circle was a young girl, no more than 8, clutching a doll that was missing an eye. She stared at me, her mouth opening slowly as a tear rolled down her cheek, and in a whisper she said, "Help us. He's coming." The room darkened, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw him, the guard, his face twisted in fury, his eyes like pits of darkness. He raised his baton, and the children screamed, their cries blending into a deafening crescendo. My vision blurred, the world spinning around me, and the last thing I heard was his growling voice, "You can't leave. No one leaves Preston Castle."